Asterisk my car is legally parked. Let it go. Asterisk. Seconds later, the little dots appeared. She was already typing. Asterisk legally parked according to who? HOA rules exist for a reason. This neighborhood has standards, and we all agreed to them. Asterisk. I rolled my eyes. Asterisk I didn't agree to anything that says my legally registered vehicle, which happens to be used for law enforcement, needs your personal approval. Asterisk. The dots appeared again. This time, they lingered for a while. She was either thinking really hard or typing an essay. I didn't stick around to find out. I set my phone down and figured I'd deal with her in the morning. But morning came sooner than expected. At exactly 6:45 a.m., my doorbell rang. Repeatedly. I groaned, rolling out of bed, already knowing who it was. When I opened the door, there she stood, arms crossed, expression smug, as if she had spent all night crafting the perfect plan. "Morning, Karen," I said, rubbing my eyes. She didn't return the pleasantries. "I spoke with the HOA board this morning," she announced. "They agree that your vehicle is in violation." I blinked at her. "The HOA board? You mean the same board that consists of you and maybe 2 other people who just nod along to whatever you say." Her expression twitched, but she recovered quickly. "That's irrelevant. Rules are rules, and I was given full authority to enforce them." I sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "Karen, let me ask you something. Do you even know why I drive an unmarked vehicle?" She hesitated, clearly thrown off by the question. "Because you don't want anyone to know you're a cop." I chuckled. "Not exactly. It's because I handle investigations where being seen as law enforcement could compromise the situation. My job relies on discretion." She pursed her lips. "That doesn't change the fact that it's an eyesore in the neighborhood." I tilted my head. "Really? An eyesore? You mean a black sit-in? The same type of car half the people on this street drive." Her fingers twitched at her side. "That's not the point," she snapped. "The point is, we have standards." I stared at her for a long moment, then asked, "Karen, what is this really about?" She blinked. "Excuse me." "This whole thing. It's not just about my car, is it?" Her jaw clenched slightly. There was something there, something deeper than just HOA rules. Maybe she didn't like the idea of someone not bending to her will. Maybe it was because she had been trying to find a reason to get rid of me ever since I moved in. Or maybe, just maybe, she didn't like that someone with authority lived right next door. She huffed. "This is about fairness." I gave her a long, steady look. "No, it's about control." For the first time, she didn't have a quick response. She stood there, lips pressed together, hands gripping the file folder she had brought with her. She was planning something. Before I could press her further, a car pulled up across the street, and my neighbor Greg stepped out, looking between the two of us. Everything okay here?" Karen straightened immediately. "We're handling an HOA matter," she said briskly. Greg looked at me. "This about your car?" I nodded. He snorted. "Karen, seriously. You do realize I park my work truck in my driveway every night, right? Nobody cares." Karen's face turned red. "That's different." Greg raised an eyebrow. "How?" She faltered. That's when I knew I wasn't the only one she had been targeting. This wasn't about cars. This was about control, just like I suspected. And now I wasn't the only one who saw it. Karen squared her shoulders, trying to regain her composure. "If you have an issue with HOA policies, you're welcome to bring it up at the next meeting." Greg chuckled. "Right. The meeting's where you talk, and we all pretend to agree so we don't get harassed." Karen's jaw tightened. If you don't like the way things are run, you should have thought about that before moving here. Greg and I exchanged a look. She was doubling down. And now I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I knew Karen wasn't going to let this go. After all, this was her thing, picking fights, enforcing rules that only seemed to apply when it suited her, and making sure everyone in the neighborhood knew she was in charge. But what she didn't realize was that this time, she had overplayed her hand. The next morning, I left early for work, keeping an eye out for any more of Karen's antics. Everything seemed quiet, but I had that gut feeling. The kind you get when you know something's coming, but can't quite see it yet. And sure enough, later that afternoon, I got a text from Greg. Asterisk, hey man, you might want to get home ASAP. Karen's up to something. Asterisk. That was all he said, but it was enough. I grabbed my keys and headed straight back. The driver arched a brow, clearly unimpressed by Karen's urgency. Ma'am, I can't just tow a car because you don't like it. I need proper authorization. Karen huffed, pulling up something on her phone. I have it right here. HOA regulations say no commercial or unregistered vehicles can be parked overnight. I called this in already. The driver sighed, looking back at me. Do you have proof of ownership? I almost laughed. Instead, I pulled out my wallet and flipped it open, revealing my badge. His eyes flicked down to it, then back up at me, and I saw the exact moment he realized what was happening. His lips pressed together like he was trying not to grin. He turned to Karen, clearing his throat. Ma'am, are you aware this is an unmarked police vehicle? Karen's triumphant expression froze. What? This car belongs to law enforcement, he said, nodding toward me. I can't tow it. Karen's face went through about 5 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and then, finally, that flicker of panic when she realized she had seriously messed up. That can't be right, she stammered, shaking her head. It's not marked. The tow truck driver just shrugged. Doesn't need to be. Unmarked vehicles are used all the time by law enforcement. He looked back at me. You at the department. I nodded. Yep. And this vehicle is assigned to me. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She was grasping for something, anything that could turn this around in her favor. Well, if it's a police car, then why doesn't it have proper identification? I raised an eyebrow. Because it's asterisk unmarked asterisk. She blinked. But you still need an HOA permit. That's the rule. The tow truck driver let out a chuckle, shaking his head. Ma'am, I don't know what to tell you. You tried to tow a police vehicle. That's not gonna happen. Karen's face was turning a shade of red I had never seen before. She turned back to me, her voice suddenly laced with forced politeness. Well, officer, I'm sure you understand. We just have to maintain the neighborhood standards. I smiled, folding my arms. Sure, I understand. Just like I understand that calling in a fraudulent tow request on a legally parked vehicle could be considered interfering with law enforcement property. Karen's eyes widened. The tow truck driver let out a low whistle. Yeah, I wouldn't push this one, lady. For the first time since this whole thing started, Karen actually looked nervous. She opened her mouth like she was about to argue, but then shut it again. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed back toward her house, muttering something under her breath. The tow truck driver chuckled, shaking his head as he walked back toward his rig. Man, I've seen some HOA folks pull power trips before, but this one takes the cake. I smirked. Yeah, she's a special case. He climbed back into his truck, gave me a nod, and rolled off down the street, leaving Karen fuming behind her curtains, and me standing there, wondering just how long it would be before she found some new, ridiculous way to make my life difficult. But one thing was for sure, this was far from over. The moment Karen disappeared behind her front door, I figured that was the end of it, at least for the night. But if there was one thing I had learned about her over the years, it was that she never let things go. Ever. So I wasn't surprised when, not even an hour later, I saw the glow of her porch light flicker on and the shadow of her pacing back and forth through her front window. I sat on my couch, sipping my coffee, watching the scene unfold like a live neighborhood drama. My phone vibrated on the table. I already knew what it was before I even picked it up. The HOA group chat. Sure enough, there it was, Karen's message, long and overly formal, posted for the entire neighborhood to see. Asterisk, dear residents, it has come to my attention that certain vehicles, which may or may not be considered appropriate for our community standards, are being parked overnight in driveways without the proper permits. We must uphold our neighborhood's pristine reputation and ensure our rules are followed. I urge everyone to be vigilant and report any violations accordingly. Asterisk. I couldn't help but shake my head. She wasn't done with me yet. A few minutes later, another text came through, this time directly to me. Asterisk A suggests you remove your vehicle before further action is taken. Consider this a courtesy notice. Asterisk. I exhaled through my nose, debating how to respond. Part of me wanted to just ignore her, but I also knew that ignoring Karen was like ignoring a wasp buzzing around your head. It only made things worse. So I typed back something simple. As I turned onto my street, I saw exactly what Greg had been warning me about. A tow truck was parked in front of my house, its driver standing next to my car, getting ready to hook it up. And there was Karen, arms crossed, that smug look on her face like she had just won some kind of prize. I pulled into the driveway and stepped out, keeping my voice calm even though my patience was running thin. What's going on here? Karen turned to me, all fake innocence. Oh, good. You're home. I was just having this illegally parked vehicle removed for violating HOA regulations. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. Karen, you know very well this car is legally parked. She smirked. I spoke to the board. We decided that unmarked vehicles give the neighborhood an unwelcoming appearance. It had to go. I glanced at the tow truck driver, who looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. Sir, I said, keeping my tone even, I suggest you check the registration before you do anything. The driver hesitated. Oh yeah, about that. She called us, said it was an abandoned vehicle. But I can't tow it if it's properly registered and belongs to the homeowner. Karen's face twitched. This isn't about paperwork. It's about the rules. Greg had stepped out onto his porch by now, along with a few other neighbors, watching this scene unfold. I could see them exchanging looks, whispering. Karen was so caught up in her power trip that she didn't even realize she was losing the crowd. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my badge. The tow truck driver's eyes widened slightly as I held it up. This isn't just an unmarked vehicle, I said. It's a law enforcement vehicle, and unless you want to explain why you're trying to tow a government-registered car, I suggest you step away. The driver immediately backed off. Look, man, I don't want any trouble. If this is your car, I'm out. He turned to Karen. You didn't mention it belonged to a cop. Karen's confidence wavered for just a second, but then she straightened, doubling down. It doesn't matter. That car is a violation of community standards. You can't just park anything you want in this neighborhood. I let out a short laugh. Karen, do you even hear yourself? You just tried to have a police vehicle towed. Do you have any idea how serious that is? She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, Greg stepped forward. Actually, Karen, I think we all have questions about how you run things around here. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered neighbors. I could see the shift happening. People were tired of her nonsense. Karen's face flushed, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. I was only doing what was best for the neighborhood. Greg folded his arms. No, you were doing what was best for you. And I think it's time we talk about that at the next HOA meeting. Karen turned back to me, eyes flashing. This isn't over. I smiled, shaking my head. Oh, I know. And just like that, the real battle had begun. Karen stormed back toward her house, but I could tell she wasn't done. She had that determined look, the kind that meant she was already plotting her next move. The crowd of neighbors lingered for a few moments, murmuring amongst themselves before dispersing. Greg stayed behind, shaking his head. She's really digging herself into a hole, he muttered. But she's not the type to back down. I nodded. Yeah, which means she's going to come back harder. And I was right. The next morning, I woke up to an email from the HOA board, an official notice of violation, citing my vehicle as a disruption to the aesthetic integrity of the community. It was laughable. She really thought a formal complaint would scare me. But that wasn't the real twist. An hour later, my captain called. Hey, he said, his voice tight. I just got an interesting call about you. I frowned. From who? An anonymous complaint about an officer abusing authority in a residential dispute. I exhaled sharply. Let me guess, Karen. I can't say for sure, but I'd bet on it, he said. She's claiming you're intimidating her and using your badge to bully the HOA into ignoring violations. I ran a hand over my face. Unbelievable. Yeah, my captain sighed. Look, I know this is ridiculous, but you know how these things go. We have to do a preliminary inquiry. I need you to keep everything by the book. I clenched my jaw. Karen wasn't just trying to get my car towed anymore. She was trying to put my job on the line. Understood, I said. I'll handle it. But inside, I was boiling. As I turned onto my street, I saw exactly what Greg had been warning me about. A tow truck was parked in front of my house, its driver standing next to my car, getting ready to hook it up. And there was Karen, arms crossed, that smug look on her face like she had just won some kind of prize. I pulled into the driveway and stepped out, keeping my voice calm even though my patience was running thin. What's going on here? Karen turned to me, all fake innocence. Oh, good. You're home. I was just having this illegally parked vehicle removed for violating HOA regulations. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. Karen, you know very well this car is legally parked. She smirked. I spoke to the board. We decided that unmarked vehicles give the neighborhood an unwelcoming appearance. It had to go. I glanced at the tow truck driver, who looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. Sir, I said, keeping my tone even, I suggest you check the registration before you do anything. The driver hesitated. Oh yeah, about that. She called us, said it was an abandoned vehicle. But I can't tow it if it's properly registered and belongs to the homeowner. Karen's face twitched. This isn't about paperwork. It's about the rules. Greg had stepped out onto his porch by now, along with a few other neighbors, watching this scene unfold. I could see them exchanging looks, whispering. Karen was so caught up in her power trip that she didn't even realize she was losing the crowd. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my badge. The tow truck driver's eyes widened slightly as I held it up. This isn't just an unmarked vehicle, I said. It's a law enforcement vehicle, And unless you want to explain why you're trying to tow a government-registered car, I suggest you step away. The driver immediately backed off. Look, man, I don't want any trouble. If this is your car, I'm out. He turned to Karen. You didn't mention it belonged to a cop. Karen's confidence wavered for just a second, but then she straightened, doubling down. It doesn't matter. That car is a violation of community standards. You can't just park anything you want in this neighborhood. I let out a short laugh. Karen, do you even hear yourself? You just tried to have a police vehicle towed. Do you have any idea how serious that is? She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, Greg stepped forward. Actually, Karen, I think we all have questions about how you run things around here. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered neighbors. I could see the shift happening. People were tired of her nonsense. Karen's face flushed, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. I was only doing what was best for the neighborhood. Greg folded his arms. No, you were doing what was best for you. And I think it's time we talk about that at the next HOA meeting. Karen turned back to me, eyes flashing. This isn't over. I smiled, shaking my head. Oh, I know. And just like that, the real battle had begun. Karen stormed back toward her house, but I could tell she wasn't done. She had that determined look, the kind that meant she was already plotting her next move. The crowd of neighbors lingered for a few moments, murmuring amongst themselves before dispersing. Greg stayed behind, shaking his head. She's really digging herself into a hole, he muttered. But she's not the type to back down. I nodded. Yeah, which means she's going to come back harder. And I was right. The next morning, I woke up to an email from the HOA board, an official notice of violation, citing my vehicle as a disruption to the aesthetic integrity of the community. It was laughable. She really thought a formal complaint would scare me. But that wasn't the real twist. An hour later, my captain called. Hey, he said, his voice tight. I just got an interesting call about you. I frowned. From who? An anonymous complaint about an officer abusing authority in a residential dispute. I exhaled sharply. Let me guess, Karen. I can't say for sure, but I'd bet on it, he said. She's claiming you're intimidating her and using your badge to bully the HOA into ignoring violations. I ran a hand over my face. Unbelievable. Yeah, my captain sighed. Look, I know this is ridiculous, but you know how these things go. We have to do a preliminary inquiry. I need you to keep everything by the book. I clenched my jaw. Karen wasn't just trying to get my car towed anymore. She was trying to put my job on the line. Understood, I said. I'll handle it. But inside, I was boiling. I spent the rest of the day keeping my head down, waiting to see what she'd try next. And she didn't disappoint. That evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I saw something new. A stack of official-looking papers taped to my front door. My stomach sank as I pulled them down. A asterisk petition for my removal from the neighborhood asterisk. She had gone door to door, collecting signatures to have me removed from the HOA community, citing ongoing disturbances and threats to the safety of residents. The kicker, she had gotten a few people to sign it. Not many, but enough to make it look legitimate. Greg appeared at my side, looking at the papers over my shoulder. Are you kidding me? I let out a low chuckle, shaking my head. She really thinks this is going to work. She's desperate, Greg said. She's losing control, and she knows it. But she's not going to stop until she takes this as far as she can. I looked across the street at Karen's house. Her blind shifted slightly. She was watching. Waiting. Fine. If she wanted a fight, she was about to get one. I took a deep breath, holding back the urge to march over to Karen's house and confront her. That's exactly what she wanted, for me to lose my cool, to give her more ammunition. But I wasn't going to play into her game. Instead, I grabbed my phone, took pictures of the petition, and sent them to my lawyer. Greg crossed his arms, shaking his head. So what now? I exhaled. Now, I let her dig her own hole. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board about Karen's repeated harassment. But I wasn't the only one. Turns out, Greg wasn't the only neighbor fed up with her. A few others had come forward with their own grievances: unfair fines, excessive rules, threats of legal action over minor infractions. Karen had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom, and people were finally tired of it. The board scheduled an emergency meeting. Karen, of course, showed up with her usual smug expression, convinced she was about to watch me get removed from the neighborhood. She even brought copies of her petition, slamming them onto the table like they were some kind of trump card. "It's all right here," she announced, looking around the room. "The majority of residents agree. This officer's presence is a disruption." I didn't say anything. I just leaned back in my chair and waited. The board members exchanged glances before one of them cleared his throat. "Karen, we actually have several complaints against you as well." That wiped the smirk off her face. "What? That's ridiculous." The board member continued, flipping through a stack of documents. "You've been issuing fines without proper votes, misusing HOA funds, and making decisions without consulting the community. Several residents have provided evidence of your behavior." Karen's face paled. "This is a smear campaign. They're just mad because I enforce the rules." One of the other board members sighed. "Karen, you tried to have an active law enforcement vehicle towed, and then you falsely reported an officer to his department. That's beyond HOA matters. That's personal harassment." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she had no response. The room fell silent. Then one of the homeowners in the back spoke up. "I vote to remove Karen from the HOA board." Another voice followed, seconded. The votes came in quickly after that. And just like that, the woman who had spent years controlling the neighborhood found herself completely powerless. Karen stood there, stunned, as the decision was finalized. "You can't do this," she muttered, but no one was listening. As the meeting wrapped up, Greg nudged me. "So does this mean she's finally going to leave us alone?" I smirked. Knowing Karen, probably not. And I was right. Because 2 days later, a for sale sign appeared in front of her house. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat, but she also wasn't the type to stick around when she couldn't be in control. She was leaving, but not before making one last statement. Later that evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I spotted her standing outside, watching me with that same icy glare. "This isn't over," she said, voice low. I smiled. "Oh, I know." And with that, Karen turned and walked inside. A week later, she was gone. The neighborhood felt different after that. Lighter. Quieter. People weren't afraid to let their kids play outside, and no one was peeking through their blinds, worried about getting fined for leaving their trash cans out too long. Greg and I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset. "Think we'll ever get another Karen?" he asked. I chuckled. "Probably. But next time, we'll be ready." And with that, life in the neighborhood finally went back to normal. At least, until the next HOA drama unfolded. In the weeks after Karen's departure, the neighborhood finally felt like a community again. People were more relaxed, more willing to chat in their yards, and there was a noticeable shift in the overall atmosphere. Without Karen's constant interference, the HOA board even started reviewing and revising some of the absurd rules she had pushed through over the years. It was almost funny how quickly things changed once she was out of the picture. Greg and I sat outside one evening, watching as a couple of kids rode their bikes down the sidewalk, something that had somehow been a violation under Karen's reign. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his drink, and smirked. It's weird not seeing her patrol the streets like some self-appointed sheriff. I laughed. Yeah, I keep expecting to look up and see her measuring someone's grass with a ruler. Greg shook his head. I still can't believe she tried to take it that far. The petition, the false complaint, even trying to tow a cop car. It's like she really thought she was untouchable. That's the thing about people like her, I said. They push and push until they finally hit a wall. Then, when they realize they can't control everything, they run. Greg nodded, then glanced toward Karen's old house. So, any idea who's moving in? I shrugged. I heard a young couple put in an offer. Hopefully, they're normal. Over the next few weeks, the house sat empty, a silent reminder of all the drama that had unfolded. Every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing over, half expecting Karen to pop out and start lecturing someone about their garbage bins. But she was gone, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood didn't feel like it was under surveillance. The HOA held another meeting, this time actually inviting residents to participate in discussions. Without Karen steamrolling over everyone, real conversations started happening. The board rolled back several ridiculous policies, including the one about how long cars could be parked in driveways. That rule alone had been the cause of so many unnecessary arguments, and now it was just common sense. If a car wasn't abandoned or causing a problem, no one cared. One afternoon, as I was washing my car, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's old place. A couple stepped out, a friendly-looking pair in their early 30s. They waved as they started unloading boxes. Greg wandered over, giving me a knowing look. Time to make first impressions before we find out if we've got another HOA Tarrant on our hands. We walked over, introduced ourselves, and within minutes, it was clear that these new neighbors were nothing like Karen. They laughed when we told them some of the old horror stories about the HOA's strictest enforcer, shaking their heads in disbelief. No way, the wife said. She really tried to tow a police vehicle. Greg grinned. Oh yeah, and that wasn't even the worst of it. Her husband chuckled. Well, you don't have to worry about us. We're just here for some peace and quiet. That was exactly what we all wanted. As the weeks passed, things settled into a new normal. The HOA meetings became more about actual neighborhood improvements rather than nitpicking every little thing people did. There were still occasional disagreements. No community is perfect, but at least they weren't being fueled by one person's obsession with control. One day, I was heading out when I noticed a letter in my mailbox from the HOA. I hesitated for a second before opening it, half expecting some last remnant of Karen's influence to come back and haunt me. But instead, it was a simple notice, just a friendly reminder about an upcoming neighborhood gathering. Greg, who had just pulled up next to me, raised an eyebrow. Another warning. I held up the letter. Nope, just an invite. Apparently, they're hosting a barbecue in the park. He smirked. See, told you things were gonna change. That weekend, the whole neighborhood showed up for the gathering. People brought food, kids played without worrying about getting fined for it, and for the first time in a long while, everyone seemed genuinely happy to be there. As I stood there, watching the community come together, I realized something. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to feel like. Not a place ruled by fear of fines and HOA threats, but a place where people actually looked out for one another. Karen had spent years trying to control everything, thinking she was making the neighborhood better. But in the end, all she had done was push people away. And the moment she lost that power, the neighborhood didn't fall apart. It actually started to thrive. Greg nudged me, breaking my thoughts. So what do you think? End of an era? I smiled, more like the start of a better one. And with that, life in the neighborhood moved on, this time without Karen watching over it. I had just pulled into my driveway after a long shift, exhausted but glad to finally be home. My unmarked police vehicle, a black sedan with tinted windows, had barely come to a stop when I noticed something her. My nosy, overbearing neighbor, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, was already outside, arms crossed, eyes locked onto me like a hawk spotting its prey. Now, I'd had my fair share of run-ins with Karen before. She was the kind of person who lived for HOA rules, the type who measured grass lengths with a ruler and sent complaint emails at 3 a.m. if a trash bin was left out a minute too long. But this time, she had a different target: my car. I barely had time to step out before she stormed over, her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown to some disaster I hadn't yet realized was coming. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice dripping with the authority she thought she had. "You can't park that here." I sighed, already knowing where this was headed. "Karen, this is my driveway." She scoffed, waving a manicured hand at my vehicle. "That thing is an eyesore. It doesn't belong in this neighborhood." I had to bite back a laugh. An eyesore? Sure, it wasn't flashy, but it was a clean, well-maintained car, one that just so happened to belong to law enforcement. Of course, I wasn't about to tell her that right away. "I'm parked legally, Karen," I said as patiently as I could, knowing full well that logic and reason were not her strongest points. But she wasn't listening. Instead, she pulled out her phone with the speed of someone about to call in the National Guard. "I'm reporting this to the HOA. You can't just dump some random, suspicious-looking vehicle in front of your house." I rubbed my temples. "It's not random. It's my car." Karen's lips twisted into a smirk, as if she'd just caught me in some grand act of defiance. "Well, it doesn't have a parking permit, and it's clearly violating community guidelines. Commercial vehicles aren't allowed overnight." I could have corrected her right then and there. Could have pulled out my badge, let her know that this so-called commercial vehicle was actually an unmarked police car used for investigations. But honestly, I was too tired to deal with her nonsense. So I just shook my head and turned to head inside. That's when she said it. "Fine, if you won't move it, I will." I stopped mid-step. "What do you mean you will?" She grinned like she had just won some neighborhood battle. "I'm calling a tow truck. That thing will be gone within the hour." Now that got my attention. My head snapped around, and for the first time, I could see just how serious she was. She was already dialing, already putting things into motion, fully convinced that she had the power to dictate what did and didn't belong in the neighborhood. I almost felt bad for what was about to happen. Almost. Because Karen had no idea what she was getting herself into. And when that tow truck arrived, and the driver realized what she was trying to have towed. Let's just say things were about to get a whole lot more interesting. I watched as Karen paced back and forth on her driveway, phone pressed to her ear, her voice growing sharper by the second. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Something about an unauthorized vehicle, and how it was disturbing the neighborhood's image. She glanced at me once or twice, smirking like she had won some great battle. I should have stopped her. I should have just told her what was really going on. But honestly, after all the headaches she had caused over the years, writing me up for leaving my trash bin out for 5 extra minutes, calling the HOA because my porch light bulb was too bright, and even complaining about my mailbox being the wrong shade of beige, I figured she deserved this one. So I leaned against my car and waited. It didn't take long. Within about 20 minutes, the deep rumble of a heavy-duty tow truck echoed down the street. A massive rig rolled up, gleaming under the streetlights, its engine humming as it came to a stop in front of my driveway. The driver hopped out, a big guy in a worn-out cap, clipboard in hand, looking ready to handle whatever job had been called in. Karen practically ran to him. "Thank goodness you're here," she said, motioning wildly toward my car. "That vehicle is parked illegally, and it needs to be removed immediately." The tow truck driver gave my car a quick once-over, then glanced at me. "This your vehicle?" I nodded. "It is." Before he could respond, Karen butted in again. No, it's not allowed here. It doesn't have a permit, and it's in violation of HOA policy. I don't care who owns it. It needs to go."